Think your 9 to 5 is bad? Try waking up at 4 a.m. every single day to the sound of a factory whistle that doesn't just interrupt your sleep, it owns your life. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution, where time is money and your body is the currency. Forget snooze buttons or remote work. In the 1800s, factory workers were chained to schedules so brutal they'd make modern hustle culture look like a luxury retreat. 6 days a week, sometimes 7, people trudged through soot-choked streets to punch into jobs that would grind their bodies into dust by the time they turned 30. 12 to 16-hour shifts weren't just common, they were expected. And no, there was no lunch break with kombucha and kale salad. If you were lucky, you got 30 minutes to swallow some bread, maybe a boiled potato, while sitting on a cold stone floor that smelled like oil, sweat, and despair. Factories back then weren't workplaces. They were mechanical beasts. Monstrous, metallic, roaring machines dominated the space, demanding endless feeding from human hands. And those hands often belonged to children. Kids as young as 5 were put to work in textile mills and coal mines, squeezing into tight spaces where adult bodies couldn't fit. Why hire a child? Because they were cheap, obedient, and expendable. If one was injured or killed, and many were, there was always another starving family nearby, willing to offer up their next born. Inside the factories, danger wasn't an accident. It was a feature. Machines had no guards, no emergency stops, no concern for flesh and bone. Fingers were lost, arms crushed, hair caught and scalped. Imagine working 12 hours beside a spinning loom, knowing that a single slip could mean permanent disfigurement or death. And if that happened, there were no lawsuits, no compensation. You got fired. Maybe your coworkers scraped together a few pennies for your burial. Maybe not. The air was its own brand of poison. Workers inhaled fibers, dust, coal ash, and chemical fumes day in and day out. Lung diseases like black lung and mill fever were so common they were practically part of the job description. And protective gear? That was a fantasy. The only thing between your lungs and industrial toxins was your own stubborn will to survive. Still think your office job is the worst? In the factories of the Industrial Revolution, you weren't an employee. You were a cog in a death machine, spinning, grinding, wearing down until you finally broke. And when you did, someone else would step in without pause. Because in this era, human life wasn't just cheap, it was disposable. Forget recess, forget cartoons, forget childhood. If you were a kid during the Industrial Revolution, your life probably didn't include toys, school, or even proper meals. It included work. Grueling, soul-crushing, body-breaking work. Childhood wasn't a phase of innocence. It was just the cheapest labor available. Factory owners loved children, not for their charm, not for their laughter, but because they were small enough to crawl under dangerous machines and too young to complain. Kids as young as 5 years old were hired to clean spinning frames, while the machines were running. One slip, one stumble, one moment of childish clumsiness, and it meant losing fingers, limbs, or worse. And guess what? If a kid did get mangled, the factory didn't stop. They just hired another one. There was always another poor, starving family desperate enough to send their child into the metal maw. Children worked 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, in conditions that would make adult men weep. No breaks, no safety gear, no sympathy, and the jobs? Haunted house level terrifying. crawling through narrow coal mine tunnels with a candle clenched between their teeth, climbing inside chimneys to sweep soot until their lungs gave out, carrying molten materials in iron foundries, lifting heavy loads until their bones curved and their spines twisted. All for a few coins, if they were paid at all. And when they collapsed from exhaustion or passed out from the heat or hunger, they were beaten. Yes, beaten. Not metaphorically. Literally. Overseers carried sticks, belts, or bare fists. A crying child wasn't a tragedy. It was a delay in production. Some children were apprenticed, which is a polite way of saying they were sold by workhouses to factory owners. Once assigned, they lived inside the factories, ate terrible food, and were locked in at night like livestock. They didn't dream of becoming astronauts or artists. They dreamt of seeing sunlight, or not dying before 12. Want to hear something darker? In many cases, parents didn't resist. They needed the income. A child earning pennies was still more than a child staying home. Starvation doesn't care about age, and neither did capitalism. Governments? They barely noticed. Early laws limited child labor to 12 hours a day. That's what protection looked like. So next time you hear someone say, "Kids these days are soft," remind them, soft is what happens when you're not crushed between iron gears before puberty. Picture this: a factory floor. Endless rows of deafening machines, all screeching, clanking, and grinding like mechanical demons in a metal cathedral. Now, imagine standing there for 16 hours straight, day after day, week after week, with no ear protection, no brakes, and no escape. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution, where the machines didn't stop, and neither could you. Factories ran on schedules stricter than prison camps. Workers had to clock in before sunrise and weren't allowed to leave until the sun was gone. Late by 5 minutes, you were docked pay. Late by 10, you were fired. Late again? Blacklisted. Inside, the air was thick with dust, smoke, and chemical fumes. Ventilation was a fantasy. Windows were sealed to preserve heat. Translation, keep you sweating like a pig in a furnace. The machines roared louder than thunder, day and night. Workers developed chronic hearing loss so early that deafness was practically considered an occupational hazard. If you worked near spinning frames or looms, your hands were constantly at risk. Threads would snap, gears would jam, and guess who was expected to fix them? You. While the machine was still running. There were no shut-off switches, no pause buttons. You reached in, fast, and hoped the steel teeth didn't chew through your fingers before you could get out. Many didn't. And if you did get injured, you didn't get time off. You didn't get compensation. You got replaced. Overseers patrolled the floor like vultures. If you slowed down, whipped. If you collapsed, dragged away. If you tried to rest your eyes for a second, slapped awake and threatened with dismissal. Sleep deprivation was part of the job description. Many workers got 4 to 5 hours of sleep per night, and even that was interrupted by pain, hunger, or nightmares about getting dragged into the gears. Weekends? What weekends? Sundays were for collapsing in your own filth, praying your body held together long enough to do it all over again on Monday. Even children weren't spared. They stood beside adults, struggling to stay upright, nodding off while machines threatened to rip them apart. Some literally died on the floor, unnoticed until someone tripped over them. And remember, these weren't war criminals. They were workers, just trying to survive, just trying to eat. The factory didn't care about your age, your injuries, or your soul. It cared about output. The machine was king. And you were just meat. If you think childhood was a time of play, school, and scraped knees, think again. During the Industrial Revolution, childhood meant labor. Hard, dangerous, soul-breaking labor. Because in the eyes of factory owners, children weren't innocent. They were cheap, obedient, and expendable. Kids as young as 5 were forced into work. Why? Because their tiny hands could reach into the narrow parts of machines where adults couldn't fit. And when, not if, they lost a finger or two, they were simply replaced by the next desperate child dragged in off the street. Some of these kids worked 14 to 16 hours a day. No breaks, no education, no sunlight, just the rhythmic thump of machines, the sting of coal dust in their lungs, and the constant threat of violence if they slowed down. Their job titles were cute: piecers, doffers, scavengers. Sounds adorable, right? Except scavengers crawled under moving machines to collect lint and debris, while the gears kept turning above them. Many of them never made it out. Children were beaten for moving too slowly. They were starved to keep them docile. And they were isolated from family, often forced to live on-site in barracks that smelled of urine, grease, and fear. If you're wondering where the parents were in all of this, the answer is simple. Right beside them. Also working. Also trying not to die. For poor families, sending their kids to work wasn't a choice. It was the only thing standing between survival and starvation. And here's the really twisted part. Many factory owners preferred child labor. Children were less likely to unionize, less likely to complain, and far more likely to accept abuse as normal. So when you hear that the Industrial Revolution brought innovation and growth, just remember, it also brought soot-covered 6-year-olds collapsing beside machines they were too small to operate and too poor to escape. Because for every shining steam engine, there were 1,000 broken childhoods grinding away in the dark. Let's be clear. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just a change in how goods were made, it was a full-blown assault on the human spirit. The factory wasn't just a place of work. It was a machine that processed people, churning them in at dawn, spitting them out at dusk, bent, bruised, and barely human. Imagine waking up before the sun. Your lungs already ache from yesterday's coal dust. You haven't even eaten, but the foreman's whistle is screaming. You run, because being late means punishment. Not a slap on the wrist, but literal lashes, wage cuts, or termination. And in this world, losing your job meant losing your ability to eat. Inside the factory, there's no conversation, no warmth, just noise, metal grinding on metal, steam screaming from valves. The floor is slick with oil and sweat. Your mind? Number. Repetition is your existence. Pull, cut, lift, stamp, again, again, again. And if you dared to dream of escape, of a life with beauty, purpose, or rest, society was ready to remind you. You are a cog in the machine. Nothing more. Workers were forbidden from organizing. Strikes were crushed with violence, sometimes military violence, because keeping you broken was in the nation's best interest. This wasn't just physical suffering, it was spiritual erosion. Religious leaders preached that your misery was divine punishment, that salvation came through obedience, not resistance. They told you to endure, to suffer with grace. Because heaven, allegedly, had better labor laws. And the worst part? After years of giving everything to the factory, your youth, your strength, your health, there was no retirement, no pension, just a quiet dismissal when your back gave out, your lungs collapsed, or your usefulness expired. Then the factory moved on. Another desperate soul waiting at the gate, ready to step in, ready to be used up. So no, the Industrial Revolution didn't just revolutionize production. It industrialized despair. So here we are. We've walked through soot-choked streets, stepped over broken fingers on factory floors, and stared into the hollow eyes of children who knew more about steam engines than bedtime stories. And after all that, you might be tempted to say, well, it was worth it. Look at what we have now: electricity, mass production, smartphones, global markets. But let me ask you something. At what cost? The Industrial Revolution gave us progress, yes, but it also gave us a blueprint for how to normalize suffering. It taught us that if you wrap misery in the language of efficiency, people will call it innovation. If you burn human lives for fuel, but keep the factory running, they'll call it growth. And that lesson, that dangerous, inhumane lesson, didn't stay in the 1800s. Today, your office might have air conditioning instead of coal smoke. You may clock in with a badge, not a punch card, and your supervisor doesn't carry a whip. But check your inbox at 9 p.m. Check your spine after years at a desk. Check your soul after selling 40 hours a week for 40 years. Because the ghosts of the Industrial Revolution? They're still here, in the unpaid overtime, in the burnout you call ambition, in the way we measure a person's worth by their productivity instead of their humanity. So the next time someone waxes poetic about the glory of progress, remind them, machines got faster. But the people? They never stopped bleeding.